If you're trying to lose weight, chances are you've probably tried one diet or another and things just haven't worked as well as you wanted them to. Now, the thing about losing weight is it's already hard enough. But what people really need to understand when they're actually embarking on their weight loss journey is you want to do it in a safe way. And that is in a way where it doesn't involve losing too much of your lean muscle mass. Because yeah, you can lose all the weight that you want, but if you lose too much of your lean muscle mass, then that's really not going to be helping you. Because one of the best indicators we have for how long someone will live is how much muscle they have. So if you're taking away your muscle, yeah, you might be losing weight, but it's not going to help you live longer. Now in this video, I'm going to go over some real weight loss strategies where you can isolate burning that fat and retain a lot of your lean muscle. I'm going to talk about different diets like fasting versus just simply cutting calories. And I'm also going to talk about some other methods that'll help you lose weight that you've probably never even heard of, like simply improving your sleep and even talking about your breathing. So let's get started. Being overweight right now is a real problem. And actually, in America, obesity is becoming an epidemic. Just to show an example, in the late 1970s, the average American male weighed about 173 pounds. Now, fast forward to today, the average adult male weighs about 200 pounds. Now, if you go back to the 1970s, someone who is 200 pounds would be considered very overweight. But right now, that is considered normal. Now, before we go into more detail on natural and healthy ways to actually start burning fat and losing weight, I want to talk a little bit about a drug called Ozempic. This drug has gotten really popular, and a ton of my patients have started going on this drug and claiming to lose a ton of weight. So what exactly is Ozempic? Well, in a nutshell, Ozempic is this injectable drug that will really suppress your appetite. Now, the reason that Ozempic has gotten really popular is that it works. It has a very high success rate, and people who go on it, they tend to lose a lot of weight very quickly. But, just like anything, if something is too good to be true, there is usually a catch. One of the major problems with Ozempic is that people lose a lot of muscle when they're doing it. And some studies are even showing that about 50% of the weight loss that people get on this drug is from their lean muscle mass. So imagine if you're an elderly person and you're taking this drug and you're losing weight, but you're also losing a ton of your muscle mass. Well, this can have some serious problems because elderly people have the hardest time building lean muscle. And if they're losing their lean muscle, which is one of the best indicators we have for how long you're going to live, then I think it's actually doing more harm than good. So if you are taking Ozempic or you're planning on taking it, one tip I would have is to make sure you're eating enough protein and also working out enough so that you can at least maintain a lot of your lean muscle. But I'm going to talk about some other methods other than a drug like Ozempic that are more natural and can actually help you start losing weight right now. So the primary aim for weight loss and a lot of different diets is to start eating less, right? It's really simple. Just eat less than you're currently eating. And the reason that this is so important is because most people simply eat too much. This point in time is very unique because this is the first time in history where we are surrounded by an ample amount of calories, and we can pretty much eat anything at any time. Now, if you go back to our ancestors were very opportunistic omnivores, meaning they had to eat out of necessity. So our ancestors would be eating pretty much anything that they could get their hands on. They'd be eating meat, different plants, they'd be eating starch, they'd be eating a lot of different fruits, honey, etc. And also our ancestors would have to go through multiple bouts of basically fasting or not eating if there was no food around. Now, the other thing with our hunter-gatherers or our ancestors is they seem to be very metabolically healthy. Now, the reason that we can know that is because we can study modern hunter-gatherer tribes, which are basically the closest thing we have to studying our ancestors. But if we took the same logic that our ancestors did now and started eating everything that we could get our hands on, obviously that would not be good because one, we'd be eating a ton of junk food, and two, we have so many ample calories around us that we could never stop eating. But this is why being overnourished and being overweight is so common. And actually about 2/3 of people are currently overnourished, where they're eating too much. And this is why doing something to help cut down the amount of calories that we're eating is needed. And really, if you want to cut down your calories, there's 3 specific ways you can do it. The first way is simply cutting calories every single meal. So every single meal, you're having smaller portions. The second way is something called intermittent fasting, which a lot of people have heard of. And the third way is doing a specific dietary restriction, where you're eating everything you normally would, but you're just cutting out one part of your diet. So for example, some people might cut out bread, some people start cutting out dairy, some people start cutting out meat, etc. Now, if you do one of these methods correctly, it can definitely work. Because the problem we have right now is when people start over-nourishing their body, they start overindulging themselves on calories that they can no longer safely store. So what does that mean? Normally, when we have an excess amount of calories, the excess will be stored as fat underneath our skin, and that's called subcutaneous fat. Now, this is the safest place for fat to be stored. But if we have way too much excess calories, like a lot of people do, then we have this spillover, where no longer can our fat be safely stored underneath our skin, it has to be stored somewhere else. And this is what's called visceral fat, where our fat starts to enter our internal organs and starts to surround our different organs, for example, like our liver. And this is how we get something called fatty liver. Now, out of the 3 different ways to start cutting your calories that I talked about, the best evidence we have is for simply calorie restriction. That is, simply every single meal, you're eating what you normally eat. You're not cutting any specific part of your diet out, but you're just having smaller portions of each of those meals. And this is exactly what most bodybuilders do when they're trying to cut weight, but still maintain their lean muscle mass. You'll notice a lot throughout this video where I focus a lot on cutting weight, but focusing on retaining a lot of your lean muscle mass. Now, the other cool thing about this simple calorie restriction is you can still eat whatever you want as long as you're cutting your calories. So that means that even if all you ate was ice cream and candy and cookies, that you would still lose weight as long as you were under that calorie limit. But obviously, if you did this, first of all, you wouldn't feel so good. Second of all, you'd feel really hungry because you're depriving yourself of a lot of necessary nutrients. So the trick to doing a calorie restriction diet is you want to eat whatever you normally are eating, but just have smaller portions of it. And we actually have a couple studies on monkeys that showed how much cutting calories can actually help you, but not only that, how important it is to actually still maintain a proper diet where you have proper nutrition. So in one study back in 2009, there was a study on monkeys, and they had 2 different groups. So one group of monkeys had this reduced calorie diet, and the other group, these monkeys were able to eat pretty much anything that they wanted to. Now, the important thing to note in this study is these monkeys were eating pretty unhealthy. This is basically the equivalent of us eating junk food for every single meal, or fast food for every single meal. So it's really similar to what I like to call the standard American diet. So the diets of these monkeys were very processed, and they had a lot of sugar in them. And what they found is the monkeys that had this calorie restriction lived significantly longer, and they looked a lot healthier compared to the monkeys that ate freely. Now, another study in 2012 showed something a little different. So the study design was pretty much the exact same. But the only difference was, at the end of the study, they found no significant difference between the monkeys that had a calorie restriction versus the monkeys that ate freely. Well, the difference here is in the second study, the monkeys ate more natural foods, and in other words, they ate a lot healthier, and their foods had a lot less sugar in it. And when the researchers dived deeper into that first study, they found that a lot of the monkeys developed something called insulin resistance and pre-diabetes. And they were also more likely to get heart disease and cancer and die from one of those reasons. Now, if you go again to the second study, those monkeys were very rarely becoming diabetics. So what do we take away? So in the first study, the diets of these monkeys were simply so bad that if you just simply cut calories, that's going to be so much better for you. So what we really need to take away from this is it's not just about losing weight. It's also about improving your metabolism, or becoming something called metabolically healthy. Because you'll notice again in the first study, so many of those monkeys became insulin resistant or pre-diabetic because of all the sugar that they were eating. And this is why the quality of food that you're eating is going to be just as important as cutting those calories. So if you're someone that eats very unhealthy and pretty much all of your meals are junk food or different fast foods, then you're going to benefit a lot from a very significant calorie restriction. But if you're someone that is already metabolically healthy and you already eat pretty healthy, then you may not need to do any sort of calorie restriction, or at least not need to do a severe calorie restriction. And the reason why, if you are metabolically unhealthy, why a very severe calorie restriction will help you is because this will help you get on that path of becoming metabolically healthy. Now, what exactly does it mean to be metabolically healthy? Well, it means that your metabolism doesn't really work so well. So your metabolism is all the reactions that go on in your body that produce energy. So all the food that you consume, your metabolism is working to break that down to convert it into energy. For a lot of people, the very first step to becoming metabolically unhealthy is when they get insulin resistance. That's where their insulin does not work as well. And this is also the first step people have to becoming either pre-diabetic or having type 2 diabetes. Now, I actually talked about some different exercises you can do to help put yourself in a more metabolically healthy state. And I'm putting a link to that in the description below, so make sure you check that out. Now, the second way to help cutting down your calories is by doing fasting. So I want to talk a little bit about that now. Fasting has become very popular. So in a nutshell, what fasting is you are doing intermittent periods of starvation. So there's multiple ways of doing this. Some people do what's called an alternate day fast, where one day they're eating like normal, and then the second day they don't eat anything. All they do is drink water. And then they keep alternating their days like this. Another way of doing fasting is a multi-day fast, where you fast for multiple days at a time. I've even seen people fast for up to 10 days at a time. Now, that may seem more extreme and more severe. Now, for some of you, you may be thinking, well, there's no way I could go a whole day without eating. Well, another way to do fasting is a time-restricted eating window, where you're eating every single day, but you're only eating in a specific time frame. So, for example, some people do where they only eat within this 4-hour eating window, and they just eat one meal a day. Sometimes people eat in an 8-hour eating window, and they only eat 2 meals a day. All you have to do when you're doing fasting is make sure you're eating in your allotted time window, and you can eat otherwise like normal. The good thing about fasting is a lot of good things happen to your body when you're not eating. For example, one thing that happens when you're fasting is your insulin drops. So this helps you become more metabolically healthy. Also, fasting can help empty out some of the fat from your liver. And also, if you fast for multiple days at a time, specifically once you pass that 3rd day of fasting, your body starts to enter a state of starvation ketosis. This is where, in the absence of normal energy, like in absence of carbohydrates, your body starts to break down its own fat as a source of fuel. But the problem right now is the research out there on fasting is still pretty weak. And specifically for the time-restricted eating, where you're eating every single day but just in a specific time frame, we have the weakest research on it. And what the studies are showing right now is, aside from cutting out the calories, there's no real other benefit to a time-restricted eating window. So what that means is, really the only benefit you get from doing a time-restricted eating, where you only eat in a lot of time every single day, is that you're cutting out calories. There's no other benefit you really get from doing that every day. Now, personally, I'd rather have 3 separate meals spread out throughout the day rather than having just one giant meal in the middle of the day, because you also got to look at how much of that food can you really absorb at once. And specifically, I want to focus on the amount of protein that you can absorb, because once again, I'm going to focus on your muscle, because you only have a certain amount of protein that you can absorb in one sitting. And if you're trying to do that all in one sitting in one meal, even if you're having enough protein to fulfill your whole day's need, it doesn't mean that all of that is going to be absorbed. So I actually used to do a type of fasting like this. I used to do a 16-8 fast, where I used to do what's called a 16-8 fast, where I fast 16 hours of the day and I eat in 8 hours out of the day. But then when I started looking more into it, I realized that for me personally, my protein intake was more important than the benefits that I'm getting from fasting. So that's why I started to go away from fasting and started focusing more on muscle. And the other thing about this 16-8 fasting, where you're fasting 16 hours of the day and you're eating 8 hours of the day, is that the original studies on this came from mice. What these mice studies were showing is mice that eat in 8 hours only out of the day, they're generally healthier than mice that eat throughout the whole day. The problem with studying mice is that mice are very different from humans. Mice will die if they go 48 hours without food. Now humans can go a full 30 days without food. And also mice only live about 2 to 3 years. So that means that doing a 16-hour fast for a mouse is the equivalent of doing a multiple day fast for a human. And also another study in 2020 took 116 people and they had them do a 16/8 intermittent fasting. And what the study showed was there was no significant benefits. There was no significant weight loss or other metabolic benefits, and a lot of other studies have found this too. So this is why I would recommend, if you are going to go into fasting, I would look into a more long-term fast where you're either doing an alternate day fasting where you're fasting one full day at a time or fasting for multiple days at a time. Because the research on this type of fasting looks a lot better than the time-restricted eating. But again, I'm going to put an asterisk here. You want to be very careful not to lose too much lean muscle when you're doing this type of fasting. Because what the studies are showing is when you're doing fasting, you can definitely lose weight, but you're also at a really high risk of losing your lean muscle. And this is if you compare doing this alternate day fasting or this multiple day fasting to simply just cutting calories every single meal. And also the other problem with doing this multiple day fasting is people generally do not have as much activity on the days that they're fasting. So what we see is these effects get more and more pronounced the longer your fast goes on. So the more days that you're fasting, the more that your activity takes a decline, the more that your energy goes down, and also the more that your muscle is lost. So in my opinion, fasting is not something that should be focused on for the rest of your life, or not something that should be done long term. I think fasting is okay for a short period of time to kind of kick your body in the right gear and to help you lose weight, but you don't want to do it for too long of a time because you're going to end up losing too much muscle, and in the long run, that's going to hurt you. And I think for most people, simply just cutting calories every single meal would be a much better way to start losing weight because you're maintaining a lot of your lean muscle mass when you do that. Now, there is one exception where I think fasting should definitely be done for people, and that's people who are very metabolically unhealthy. So people who are very obese or very overweight and they're really struggling just burning any fat in general, then I think those people will benefit from fasting because even though they're losing some muscle when they do that, they're still going to be losing a majority of fat overall, and it's still going to be helping them in the long run. Now, another common way people try to lose weight or try to cut out some of their calories is they do some sort of dietary restriction where they stop eating one part of their diet. So some people stop eating bread, like I said, or some people stop eating rice. Some people try to stop eating carbs as much as general unless they're eating fruits. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because I think as long as you're getting your nutrients, I really don't care which method you choose because it's still going to work for you. Because I feel like nutrition is really a lot less complicated than people make it seem. You know how we're seeing all these different opinions. We're seeing opinions on being vegan or vegetarian, or you should be a carnivore, or you should be definitely an omnivore, or how there's only this one specific diet that everyone in the world should start doing because that person has all the answers. It can get really overwhelming and it can get really annoying. But the reason that all these different people have all these different diets that they claim are successful is because all of them can work. Really what nutrition comes down to is 1, not eating too much and not eating too little. And 2, making sure you're eating enough protein and also getting enough of your essential fats. 3, making sure you're getting enough vitamins and minerals. And 4, avoiding different pathogens like E. coli or mercury or having too much lead. Now, all the other stuff about going vegetarian, going vegan, going carnivore, we evolved as omnivores. So I think if we have an omnivore diet, then you should be just fine. But if you cut out one part of your diet, as long as you're meeting those other checks I talked about, you should still be fine. The only thing we really know for sure about our diets is that refined carbohydrates are bad for you and that most processed foods are bad for you. So one tip I have for you is if you're going grocery shopping, stay away from the middle of the grocery store and try to stay more on the edges, because the edges is where we see a lot more of our natural foods, like our fresh meats, a lot of our fruits and vegetables, etc. Now, the next part of this video, I want to focus less about what you're actually eating and more about what you're actually doing throughout the day. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how you're sleeping and how you are breathing, and how these two things, while they may seem really insignificant, can actually do a whole lot in helping you lose weight. People who are trying to lose weight often overlook how they are sleeping. But what we know from studies is simply being sleep deprived can make it a lot harder for you to shed weight. So one example of this is scientists from around the world did different studies where they found a huge association between being sleep deprived and having type 2 diabetes. So I talked a lot about this before and in some other videos, but it's really hard for someone to lose weight if they are metabolically unhealthy. And I think that the first step that people need to take to start losing weight is to start becoming more metabolically healthy. Because if someone is metabolically unhealthy and their insulin isn't working so well and their metabolism isn't working so well, then it's going to be really hard for that person to start burning fat. Now, one of the first steps to someone becoming metabolically unhealthy is something called insulin resistance. So normally, if you have a glucose spike or a sugar spike in your body, your insulin will come in to bring that glucose down and to start storing it safely. But if your insulin is not working so well, then it's not going to be able to safely store that glucose. And instead, you're going to be in this state of hyperglycemia. And this is something that people who are diabetic have to struggle with. And also, your body's going to be in this constant state of storing fat. Now, if we have this huge association between being sleep deprived and people having diabetes, that can be kind of scary because a lot of people are chronically sleep deprived. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your sleep deprivation causes your diabetes, right? Because it could be the other way around. Your diabetes could be what's causing your sleep deprivation. Well, scientists wanted to address this very question, so they did an experiment. So they took these healthy people and they had them start becoming sleep deprived. So they forced them to only sleep 4 hours a night for just 6 nights. And after just 1 week of being sleep deprived, these healthy people were now 40% less effective at safely storing their glucose. Now, just to take this into perspective, if these same people were taken to an independent doctor and that doctor had no clue about the sleep study that was going on, those people would be diagnosed as pre-diabetics and they would go on a strict regimen to prevent them from becoming type 2 diabetics. Now, scientists even looked into this more deeply because they wanted to know what specifically was causing that glucose to not be absorbed. So scientists took biopsies of all these participants and they looked at their cells and they found that the cells of these participants had become way more insulin resistant. In other words, the cells had become a lot less responsive to glucose. Now remember what I said from before about insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. This is all the first step that people get to having this metabolic disorder and start having this weight gain that they can no longer control. And there's also some reports that when people are sleep deprived, they tend to eat more in general. And part of this could be just because they're trying to keep themselves awake, and if they're sleep deprived, that's the only way they can do it. But more specifically, not only do these people eat more, they eat more junk food. So there's a sleep researcher named Dr. Van Cotter who did a lot of studies on this. And one of the things that she found is when people are sleep deprived, they start to lose their ability to control their hunger. So we have these two hormones that are responsible for us either feeling hungry or feeling full. One of them is called leptin, the other one is called ghrelin. So our leptin, when that starts spiking, that means that we're going to start feeling more full. But when our ghrelin starts spiking, that means we're going to start to feel hungry. So in one of our studies, she had people sleep deprived to just 5 hours a night. Now, just to keep in mind, a lot of people think that 5 hours is enough sleep. But people who were just sleeping 5 hours a night had a huge spike in their ghrelin levels. And they also had a significant decrease in their leptin levels. So these people were going to be left feeling a lot more hungry throughout the day. Now, Dr. Cotter didn't just want to study if people felt more hungry. She also wanted to study if people actually ate more food when they were sleep deprived. So in a different study, she had people first sleeping 8.5 hours a night, and then she lowered their sleep to 4.5 hours a night. And in both of these conditions, they were doing the same amount of physical activity and they had free range of food, as much as they wanted to eat. And what you found is when people were sleeping less, they ate about 300 more calories a day. And similar studies also showed the same thing even if people were sleeping 5 to 6 hours a day. Now, if you scale that up to a year, that 300 extra calories a day will be over 100,000 calories in a single year. Or in other words, people will be likely to gain almost 30 pounds in a single year just from being sleep deprived. Now let's say you scale that down in half because half the year you're sleeping enough. Well, that's still about 15 pounds of weight gain in a year. Now that's not even the worst part of this study. The other thing that she found is people craved a lot more junk food specifically. People craved a lot more carbohydrates and unhealthy foods when they were sleep deprived. So not only were people eating more food, they were eating more junk food specifically, and that's just going to further put them on the weight scale where they're struggling losing weight. Now, the other important thing about sleeping more is it's also going to help you maintain your muscle. I know I talked a lot about maintaining your muscle and how important it is to maintain your muscle for a long period of time because, like I said, muscle mass or your muscle strength is one of the best indicators we have for how long you're going to live. And the more muscle someone has, the longer they tend to live. So this is a really good thing to make sure that you're keeping track of and really focusing on maintaining your muscle. Well, what if you are a sleep-deprived person and you just can't help but only get 4.5 hours of sleep, but you're really focused on your diet and you say, no matter what, I'm still going to eat only X amount of calories and I'm not going to eat any more than that. Well, you may still lose weight, but the specific type of weight you're going to lose is going to be way more likely to be lean muscle. So in a different study, researchers took overweight people and they had them go on a very strict calorie reduction. So they had them go on this very strict diet, but the only difference was in the two groups, one group slept 4.5 hours a night and the other group slept 8.5 hours a night. Now, the results of the study were good for both groups on paper because both of the groups lost weight. But the group that slept less, 70% of their weight loss came from their lean muscle mass, as opposed to the other group, over 50% of their weight loss came from their fat, and they were able to retain a good amount of their lean muscle mass. So this is why it's so important to make sure that you're sleeping enough. You really want to focus on sleeping 8 hours a night consistently. Because if you're not, then not only is it going to be harder for you to lose weight in the first place, it's also going to be very unlikely that you're going to lose weight because you're going to be way more likely to eat more and you're going to be craving a lot more junk food, so it's going to be a lot harder. But also, if you are able to overcome all these other problems of being hungry and you manage to go on a calorie restriction, then you're going to struggle even more because even if you're losing weight, you're going to be losing more muscle. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to weight loss is something that you probably didn't even think about. It's simply the way that you breathe. One of the simplest things you can start doing right now to help you lose weight is to start breathing less. So many people have become what is called over-breathers, where they start breathing way more than their body needs. So researchers actually looked at multiple studies and they found that about 100 years ago, people's breathing volume was about half what our breathing volume is today. 100 years ago, our breathing volume would be on average of 5 to 6 liters of air per minute. So people on average, when they were breathing in and out, that total volume of air that was being exchanged was only about 5 to 6 liters of air. Now, people are breathing about 12 liters of air per minute. So that total amount of volume now has doubled. So why has that happened? Well, I could spend a whole hour or even longer talking about why this specific change has happened to our breathing. But I'm going to put a link in the description below where you can learn more about that. But essentially, after changes in industrialization and people eating a lot more fast foods and eating unhealthier, people have started becoming more unhealthy and they have started breathing a lot more and more. And specifically, people have started breathing more through their mouth as opposed to their nose. Now, when it comes to breathing less and how this can actually help you lose weight, we have some evidence on this. So since 1957, scientists have found that when animals move to living in higher altitudes, they start to tend to lose weight. And they also found that animals that permanently live in higher altitudes compared to animals that live at lower altitudes, those animals at the higher altitudes tend to be thinner compared to the animals at sea level. So because of this, there has been a ton of studies asking whether or not living at higher altitudes can help fight obesity. The problem is that we cannot all just move to areas that are high altitude. It's not practical for a lot of people just to pick up and move to areas that are high up in the mountains. But the good thing is we are able to do some sort of high altitude training or simulate living in a high altitude condition while sitting in our living room. So one guy who has studied this a ton is a guy named Patrick McKeown. And he actually developed something called the oxygen advantage, where he starts actually training people to start not only living on a shortage of oxygen, but also training athletes having a shorter amount of oxygen, because this will not only simulate them being at a higher altitude, it'll also make their body work a lot more efficiently. So the main thing with pretending to be at a higher altitude is learning how to breathe less than you currently are. So Patrick McKeown was able to train a bunch of people on how to start breathing less. And what he's found is some people are able to lose about 2 to 6 pounds within a span of 2 weeks by simply just changing their breathing. So one reason an increased amount of breathing is bad if you're trying to lose weight is the more that you breathe, the more likely you are to be stressed out and anxious. And we have a lot of studies that are documented that show that people who are more stressed out and anxious tend to eat more than people who are more relaxed. And the other thing about reducing your breathing is when you reduce your breathing, then your blood sugar levels actually drop. So for people who are diabetics or have high blood pressure, there's been reports that both of those things get improved when people learn how to survive with less oxygen. So why exactly does this reduced breathing simulate living at a higher altitude? Well, one thing that happens when you go to a higher altitude is the amount of oxygen in that atmosphere drops. So this is why if you've ever gone to Colorado or gone up in the mountains, why it's so much harder for you to breathe and you feel like you're out of breath, because there's less oxygen around in that air. And this is also why athletes, when they're training for a big competition, they go to train in these higher altitudes so that they're used to this shortage of oxygen. And when they come back to normal sea level and to do their competition, they're at a higher advantage compared to other people. Well, you can take this same logic and do this in your everyday life by simply reducing the amount of air that you're breathing. So one simple way to start reducing the amount of air that you're breathing is to start using your nose to breathe instead of your mouth. So the very first step I always tell everybody is anytime you are at rest, and by rest I mean times where you are not exercising or times where you are not doing any sort of physical activity. So if you're sitting on your couch or if you're doing work on your laptop, that is what I consider to be at rest. At all those times, you want to only be using your nose to breathe. So that is step number one. If you cannot do that, then that's what you want to focus on. And I actually made other videos where you can actually improve your breathing through your nose. I know a lot of people say that my nose is super stuffy or I have these allergies and I can't breathe through my nose properly. I'm putting a link below where I talk about how to unblock your nose properly and how to start breathing through your nose more. And the other part of reducing your breathing is actually incorporating this into your exercises. So one way to do this is next time you're doing your cardio exercise or going for a run, try to only breathe through your nose. What you might find is you actually have to go a little bit slower at first to start making sure you can only breathe through your nose because you're going to start feeling out of breath, because your nose is not able to get in as much oxygen as your mouth. But what studies are showing is after 2 weeks of keeping this up, not only are you going to be able to be at your baseline level again, you're actually going to improve your performance compared to your baseline. Now, another aspect you can really start to incorporate to reduce your breathing is to start doing some sort of breath holds, where you're holding your breath while going for walks or holding your breath for certain parts of your exercise, because this is another way to deprive your body of oxygen and train your body to survive with less oxygen. Now, I go into this more detail in another podcast where I kind of go over some specific exercises and how to do this more correctly. So I'm putting that link in the description below as well. So make sure you check that out if you want to learn more. But again, when it comes to breathing through your nose, there's so many other aspects of your life that it'll improve if you learn how to become a nose breather as opposed to being a regular mouth breather. And in those videos and those links below, I also talk about the benefits of nose breathing as well. So you can learn more about that too.
A lot of people don't think it's possible for them to get a full 8 hours of sleep every night. And I don't really blame them because I didn't think this was possible either for me. I thought the most amount of sleep I could get was about 6.5 hours for a long time. But you might be surprised that there's a lot of little things you can start doing to start increasing the amount of time